All right. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our whiskey webinar. First of all, thank you very much for spending your time after work to joining us. I'm a whiskey specialist of Rare Finds Worldwide. We are a cask dealer. We primarily help private clients to buy casks from distilleries, from independent bottlers in Scotland for investment purposes, basically. So to start off, what is Scotch whiskey? Scotch whiskey is basically a distilled grain or malt spirit that has to be aged in oak casks for at least 3 years, right? It's been around for more than 250 years, so it's got a very, very long history and heritage. So within these more than 2 centuries of time, they have developed very strict rules and definitions as to what can be legally called Scotch whiskey. So it is a highly regulated industry with a transparent regulation. That's why it makes it relatively easy as an investment product when compared to other whiskey markets. So the Scotch Whisky Regulation actually defines Scotch whisky into 5 different categories. So we have blended whiskey, blended malt, blended grain, single malt. So blended whiskey generally refers to your everyday big brand whiskeys for the likes of Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, Valentine's. Most of the lower price whiskeys you will find in the market are going to be blended whiskey, and they contribute to 95% of the consumption of Scotch whiskey, and roughly around 75% of the value. As you would see, it is the cornerstone of whiskey. But however, when we talk about investing in whiskey, more than often we are talking about single malt whiskey. So single malt whiskey means that it is the 100% malt spirit, and it comes from only one single distillery. So what makes it so special is that since it comes from only one distillery, and there are more than 150 distilleries currently in Scotland, each and every distillery has their own unique method of producing whiskey. They've got their own heritage, their own geographical location, their own methods, and their own ingredients, such and such. So these things combined makes each and every single malt from various distilleries taste uniquely different. It's that sort of uniqueness and a variety of flavors from different distilleries that makes connoisseurs and collectors want to pursue and want to chase different kinds of whiskeys. So it's this sort of collection and fascination towards the variety of flavors brought by different distilleries that makes Scotch whiskey collectible, and that makes it a very, very fascinating drink for people to keep on buying and buying. So when it comes to blended whiskey, the opposite is true. So it is made for the sake to produce a mass product that appeals to as many people as possible. It's aiming for a homogeneously tasty whiskey that is going to appeal to most people, but it does not provide the most important part, which is variety. Therefore, it doesn't make a good collection. So when we talk about single malt, when people collect, people put it into their collection, people buy limited bottles, that's what drives the price increase. That's what makes it worth investing. So in order to understand Scotch whiskey, we have to understand how it's made. So single malt Scotch whiskey, the raw ingredient is going to be barley. So the first step is obviously harvesting. Sorry, I just want to get the, whoops. Here we go. Right. So the first step is, of course, to harvest the barley plant. And then in order to turn barley into malt, it has to go through a malting process. It is then ground into finer pieces through a mill, and then steeped in warm water through a process called mashing to extract all the sugar contents into the water. Yeast is then added for fermentation to produce alcohol. It then goes through a process of double distillation to raise the alcohol level to roughly around 63.5% before it is being filled into an oak cask. Again, the regulation states that it has to be aged in an oak cask for a minimum of 3 years before it can be bottled as a drink. So when people talk about investing in whiskey, they're either talking about buying whiskey in the form of rare bottles or buying them in the form of a cask, and they are two drastically different approach. So when people buy into bottles, most of the time they are looking for a relatively short-term investment. A lot of investors would be looking to buy limited and hyped products, hoping that they would rise up in price due to heavy demand. Sometimes you can be able to gain 3-4 times of value within a year's time. But of course, when there are big winners, there's also big losers. So the price fluctuation of bottles can be very, very huge. And it requires much more knowledge and much more in-depth analysis in order to find the right bottles to buy. However, when it comes to buying a cask, it's an entirely different approach. Buying a cask requires patience, and the value comes from the time of aging. So when people actually buy and hold on to the cask, the main source of appreciation in value comes from the aging process. So when you go to a supermarket and buy a bottle of whiskey, you will see, for example, an age statement stating the age of the whiskey. You see it says Highland Park 18 years old, it says Bowmore 12 years old. That age statement indicates the time the liquid is spent in an oak cask. So when the liquid is being aged in the cask, as time goes by, it absorbs flavor from the cask, it interacts with the oak, also the harshness of the alcohol dissipates, therefore making it a more pleasant drink as time goes by. Therefore, what it means is that as the whiskey ages, as you hold on to the asset, it actually provides an intrinsic value increase as opposed to just sitting there. It actually becomes a better product as you hold on to it and letting it age. But what's more important is as you age the whiskey, each and every year you age it, the legal age of the whiskey actually increases, meaning that eventually the number that it can be put on the age statement is larger. So in whiskey, the larger the age statement, the older the whiskey, it's always more expensive. That's just how the industry works. For the past 2 centuries, the older the whiskey, due to the time cost spent aging the whiskey, it has to be priced more expensively, or else no one would bother aging them. Therefore, each and every year you age it. If you buy a cask at 12 years old and you age it for 6 years and it becomes 18 years old, you are able to resell the cask to the market at its 18 years old price, as opposed to when you bought it, it's at the 12 years old price. So that age difference is the main value that you gain when you buy a cask of Scotch whiskey. It's also worth noting that there's natural scarcity caused by physical limitations of aging, most importantly from the alcohol content. According to Scotch whiskey regulations, the alcohol content ABV level of Scotch whiskey has to be about 40%. So every year you age the whiskey, it loses about 0.5% due to natural evaporation. Therefore, as you can imagine, most casks don't actually survive up to 40 or 50 years old. So as the cask gets older, because most casks do not survive to an old age, these casks become exponentially rare. And so as you can imagine, when cask gets to an old age, the increase in value is not linear, but exponential. So a 30-year-old whiskey is not going to be 3 times the price of a 10-year-old whiskey. It's going to be 5 times or even 10 times the price. A 20-year-old whiskey is also not going to be the same 4 times the price of a 5-year-old whiskey. It's going to be 10 times or even 20 times. So the exponential effect is what makes aging a cask of whiskey a sexy and profitable investment. It's also worth noting that there are obviously popular ages in whiskey, such as 15 years old, 18 years old, 25, 30, 35, 40. These sort of what we call as popular ages or anniversary ages would provide a spike in value when the whiskey actually hit that sort of age, hence making it the ideal time for investors to sell. Historically speaking, the average value of a cask appreciates roughly around 15% every year. In Rare Finds Worldwide, we tend to be able to pick investment-grade casks from renowned distilleries at a very nice age. Therefore, a lot of casks that we buy for our clients actually achieve 20 or even 30%. For example, last year, we worked with a lot of Kleinish Lafroy, and Springbank casks. If you've been following the market, you will notice that these are all whiskeys that have risen in value the most in 2020. A lot of them were, after we traded out for them, they've been earning around 30% per year in terms of return. It's also worth noting that nowadays, investors and high net worth individuals do treat Scotch whisky as a risk haven, just like gold during economic uncertainties. The cask, this is because the cask value, the cask appreciation is pretty much unaffected by economic scenarios. So the maturation of whiskey, the improvement of the quality of the liquid does not rely on economic environment, does not rely on the financial market. Therefore, even if the financial market goes up and goes down, the whiskey still improves, the age statement still increase, and it acts as a natural hedge towards the market. Even during the 2008 economic recession, Scotch whisky still reaches a record high in value. Even during COVID breakout during the February last year, April auction prices, May auction prices, we still see record-breaking values. As a matter of fact, 2020 was actually one of the best years in terms of price appreciation for investment-grade whiskeys as a whole. So just a bit of market information for everyone. Basically, the market size of whiskey has been steadily increasing for the past decade. In 2009, it's increased by 4.4% in terms of Scotch whisky exports. It currently contributes to 75% of the entire Scottish food and drinks exports, and also 21% of the entire UK food and drinks exports. But what's more important, what's more worth noting, it's the data we observed in 2020. So in 2020, obviously due to the COVID situation, due to lockdown around the world and the plummet of the F&B scenario, we do expect, as expected, Scotch whisky consumption has actually declined. In fact, Scotch whisky exports volume has declined by 13% in 2020, mostly due to the decrease in the number of renewed bottlings due to lockdown and the decreased consumption from the F&B venues. However, auction prices of the most traded bottles, according to the Whisky Stats Whisky Index in 2020, has increased by 25%, which is the largest growth for the past decade. Top brands, the likes of Springbank, Lafroy, has reached 30% in terms of price increase in 2020. What the takeaway of this is that even during a lockdown scenario, decrease in supply, investment-grade single malts still outperforms regular drinking whiskeys. Famous brands and aged whiskeys are actually going stronger than ever as an investment asset. I think this is something very important to bear in mind, that people are actually starting to treat this as a very important asset. So there's the drinkers market, but there's also a huge investment market in single malts. So in order to buy a cask, of course, we have to understand where these casks come from and who are we actually buying them from. So the basic production unit of casks of whiskey is, of course, the distilleries that produce them in Scotland. So these distilleries, they forecast 10, 20, 30 years of the demand in advance, because imagine they distill the spirits today. These spirits go into a cask and they will not see the market in 10 or 20 years' time. Therefore, more than often, they will produce more spirits than they actually sell this year. And of course, understanding the power of aging, they would keep a lot of rare whiskeys in their cellar, and they will also sell a lot of casks to independent bottlers. Independent bottlers are also known as IB. These IBs will purchase casks from distilleries. They do not own distilleries themselves, therefore they do not produce whiskeys, but they will buy casks of whiskeys directly from distilleries, and they will release these bottlings themselves. They would also sell casks to individual investors, individual bar owners, or institutional investors. So these casks that have left the distillery and are circulating in the secondary market are what we refer to as independent bottling casks, and that's where people as individual investors like yourselves will be able to buy and trade these casks freely in the market. These casks often being traded in between IBs, individuals, investors, and we, Revans Worldwide, as a broker, we will be able to help you find the casks that you need within our network of suppliers. So in order to value a cask, you have to understand a few very important concepts. The first very important concept is the difference between an IB and an OB. For example, if you go to a supermarket and you see a bottle of Macallan 12 years old, that is a official bottling, and that is a batch whiskey. So batch whiskey refers to whiskeys that are produced by blending hundreds and hundreds of casks together into one gigantic vat and bottling them to make sure the product provides a homogeneous and consistent quality. So, however, the casks that you buy in the secondary market are always independent bottling casks, and they are always come in a form of a single cask. Single cask meaning that the whiskeys produced to producing these bottles are drawn from only one cask of whiskey, meaning that if a cask of whiskey can yield 300 bottles, it will only give you 300 bottles of whiskey, meaning that they are limited in nature and are often more pricey in the market. So in order to value a cask, what we would do is that we will make comparables with bottles in the market with the same parameters. So we look into independent bottlings, we look into single cask bottlings, and we look into the price to compare the price with the cask that we want to buy in order to find out whether we are buying at an accurate market price. So for example, if we want to buy a cask of Highland Park 18 years old, for example, and it was offered at a price, it's got 100 bottles and it's offered at a price of £100 per bottle. If we are considering it, then we look into independent bottling market, we look into single cask Highland Parks. If the Highland Parks in single cask offerings in the retail market are selling at 200 or 300 bottles, £300 per bottle, we know that we are getting this cask at a good value. And then vice versa. If it's lower than that, we know that it's at a lower value. Therefore, we use retail bottling price as a comparable as an anchor to judge whether the casks are buying at a good price. So take retail price minus sales margin minus duties and bottling costs and add around 10 to 12% as a premium of aging potential, then you get an accurate estimation of what a cask should be worth. However, it's worth noting that the premium for aging potential does differ very much in between distilleries. Famous distilleries, obviously people are willing to pay a much higher premium, whereas lesser known distilleries, people would probably even put a discount on it. So this is a model that we use typically to find out what kind of a person you are, and in order to find the right cask for you. A DCI model refers to drinker, collector, and investor. Obviously, drinker would care about the taste, the quality of the cask. They might not care as much about the brand, but they would want something decently aged and ready to be drank anytime. So maybe they will be happy to forgive the fame of the brand as opposed to the price. And when it comes to investors and collectors, obviously they will look for rare stuff. They will look for hyped projects, hyped casks from hyped distilleries. They will look for things that are decently aged. And especially for investors, they look for aging potential, which means that they want casks with a high ABV in order for them to age it for a longer time. So no matter what kind of person you are, there's always casks that we will be able to find that suits your need. However, generally, we do not recommend people buying cheap and young casks from unknown distilleries. Some of them might come at a very low price. For example, £2,000, £3,000 for a 0-year-old cask from an unknown distillery. These whiskies, even though they still might be good, however, they take a lot of time to age. They are not ready to bottle in 10 years time. Therefore, it's going to be a long time for you to hold. No one's going to buy it off you. Hence, the liquidity is bad. Therefore, we always advise investors to actually buy casks from famous distilleries and also at a decent age, so that it is a liquid asset in the market. You can trade the cask, you can sell the cask anytime you want. So obviously there are a lot of factors affecting the price of the cask. The first and most important factor is the distillery. It tells you about the spirit quality, the marketing tactics, ownership, history, and fame, so on and so on. So the price difference between different distilleries can be so huge. The price difference between, for example, a Macallan that is 20 years old and from for example, a Tullibardine that's 20 years old can be 10 times or even 20 times. Therefore, the single most important factor that affects the price of the cask is which distillery does it come from. And we often always advise people to buy from good and high quality, globally recognized distilleries. The second important factor is the age. While it's very important, the age is very simple. Older always means higher price. So as a drinker, obviously some people prefer younger whiskeys, some people prefer older whiskeys. It's just a matter of personal taste. However, when it comes to investment, older always means higher price. So this is a very important fact to bear in mind. The next important factor is cask type. So the majority of the casks being used in the industry are sherry and bourbon. 10% of the casks being used in the Scotch whisky industry are sherry casks, whilst 90% are bourbon casks. And then there's less than 1% of that are wine and rum and beer casks. Obviously, sherry casks always command for a premium because they are rarer and people can perceive them as better quality. 90% of the casks being used are bourbon casks. Since they are the majority of casks being used, it's always a safe bet. Wine, rum, beer, other kind of quirky casks, even though they are very rare, they do not necessarily command for a higher price, but sometimes there are novelty values for certain collectors that are looking for unique products. Vintages. So vintages are not as important in whiskey as compared to wine. Obviously, for wine, there are certain great vintages that command for higher price, but whiskey, the age is much more important than the vintage. So there are not particularly better vintages. It's all about the age. And then there's ABV. So the ABV of a cask does not necessarily charge for a higher price, but it does determine aging potential. If you're aiming to age a cask for like 10 or 20 years, then you will have to aim to buy a cask that still has, let's say, 55, 56% ABV. If you're only aiming for buying a cask that you can age for 3, 4, 5 years, then you might be able to look into a cask with a lower ABV and a better value. So this is basically what a cask offer example would look like. A Bowmore 1995, meaning that this cask is produced in Bowmore Distillery and in 1995, meaning that currently it is 21 years old. The cask type is a first fill sherry hogshead. First fill meaning that the cask is being filled with whiskey for the first time. Sherry is the type of cask, and hogshead is the shape of a cask. The ABV level tells you, again, the ABV level, obviously. The RLA refers to the regauged liters of alcohol. It means the amount of pure alcohol in the cask. So the volume of the cask times the ABV equals to the RLA. So the estimated bottles means the volume of the cask. It is by 700 milliliters per bottle. The per bottle value and the cask price. So the cask price, so the per bottle value basically would tell you the average price per bottle. So it would be used as a parameter to judge whether you're buying it at a good value. It is basically just the cask price divided by the estimated bottles. So obviously casks come in various sizes. You will find tiny casks in the market, such as blood tubs, octaves, and quarter casks. These casks are generally not advised as investment choice because they are designed to increase the speed of maturation, meaning that you cannot age them for a long time. And then you've got the American Standard Barrel and Hogshead. These casks are the most commonly seen casks in the market. They can either be bourbon or sherry. Port pipes are larger casks that has recently been filled with ports. And then you've got the largest sherry butts and sherry puncheons, which are beyond 500 liters, gigantic casks, and they are often a little bit more pricey. So when it comes to brands, again, there are roughly around 150 active distilleries currently in Scotland, and we generally only advise people to buy the top 50 distilleries, basically. So the blue chips are obviously Macallan, Bowmore, Dalmore. These would all be brands that you guys have all heard of and often seen in auction houses and everywhere in the world, basically. These are basically distilleries. These casks have been ever increasing in price for the past 10 years, and we don't see any sort of momentum of them slowing down. Therefore, if you are able to afford it, if your budget allows, these are always some of the best investment choices. And then you have front runners like Lefroy, Springbank, Clynelish, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Glendronach, so on and so on. These distilleries are also catching up to the blue chips. Last year, Springbank is actually the #1 distillery in terms of value increase. Again, Lefroy and Clynelish, last year we've traded out a few clients who has gained more than 30% per year with Lefroy and Clynelish casks. And then you've got the Solid and Strong, which are also globally recognized distilleries with a strong fan base. Even though their price levels are not as high as the Macallan, Bowmore, and Dalmore, they are still very, very popular choice. And if you are a relatively budget investor that cannot afford to pay £500,000 for a cask, these would be the good choice where you can still get casks at a relatively reasonable price and still have a lot of aging potential. The likes of Kooyla, Highland Park, Mortlach, Bullardi, Bunnahabhain, so on and so on. And rising stars are the ones that we believe are more speculative choices, but they're still very, very good choice. Glen Elgin, Glencleave, Leduc, Van Reens, Van Nivers, so on and so on. These distilleries do not have a wide official bottling range, but they are very, very popular in the independent bottling market and therefore are very good investment choices as well. So when you work with us, of course, we would first establish a reason for you to buy a cask. Some people will buy for anniversary, some people will buy it for an occasion, for marketing, and some people are just looking to buy it for invest. So if you're buying it for investment, of course, we want to understand your budget. We want to understand the time frame you hope to hold on to a cask. Maybe you want to hold it for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Different casks, different goals would require different age, different distilleries in order to fit your requirements. So once you've chosen a cask that you like, we will handle all the documentation, complete the purchase process, and transfer the cask under to your name. We would help you mature and manage the cask in HMRC bonded warehouses in Scotland. The Scotch whisky regulation does dictate that all casks have to be aged in HMRC licensed bonded warehouses for their entire lifetime. Therefore, you cannot actually ship the cask outside the country, but that's actually a good thing. So you don't actually have to manage the cask. You have professionals in Scotland to handle that for you. So let's say you've held the cask for 5 years and you believe it's the right time to sell. Obviously, we will provide expert guidance on exit options. You can sell them through our network of investors. You can sell them through auction house. We will help you handle all documentation. We'll hold your hand through the entire process. Again, most of the time, casks target 15% per year in terms of investment return. But a lot of times with casks that we pick, we can often achieve 20 or even 30% investment yields. Once again, all casks will be stored in third-party bonded warehouses with a bottling plant. Therefore, in case you've grown emotional with your cask and you would like to bottle it, we can help you bottle the cask and we can help you import it into the country. You can draw samples of your cask, you can visit your cask, you can re-rack your cask if you want. Re-racking basically means to transfer the content from one cask into another empty cask. The most often way to do it is to transfer the bourbon cask spirits into a sherry cask to give it a sherry finish to increase its value. This is very common practice amongst investors nowadays. For older casks, we do recommend doing an annual regauge just to keep track of the ABV level and the liquid level. And for younger casks, we will recommend doing a regauge every 3 years. For the first 3 years, storage and insurance costs will be covered by us. After 3 years, it's going to be £65 per cask per year. So it's a very minimal maintenance cost to hold on to a cask. So that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll try to answer them as much as possible. If you think of any questions later on, just feel free to contact us anytime. I hope we'll be able to be in touch with you guys to later on to know a little bit more about your interest in whiskey. Once again, thank you very much of your time. So if you guys have any questions, do fire away. Thank you. All right. If there's no questions, once again, thank you very much for attending. I hope we can be in touch and see you guys next time. Thank you.